And we're live on YouTube. Welcome everyone to another NPM Open RFC call. Today's date is Wednesday, August 4th, 2021. We're going to be following along the agenda that was posted in issue number 426. This conversation is going to be more like a deep dive on specifically the NPM audit assertions RFC and just audit improvements in general. As we outlined last week, we want to go in and probably spend a whole hour on this space. And so I've queued up essentially a number of resources there in the RFC agenda itself. And if folks have been following along in the 422 RFC audit assertions, they'll know that there's been a lot of discussion since the last time we talked last week when Tierney opened this. Just before we jump into that and the topic of audit improvements, just want to again outline that this call and all calls and comms are governed under a code of conduct that we ask people to please be mindful and respectful of each other. When others are speaking, please raise your hand and I'll call on you to ideally have a good discourse on these calls. Yeah, in terms of any announcements, I want to give some space for folks. If you do happen to have an announcement, feel free to let us know now.
Not sure if that's an announcement, but I've added a comment and I can post it also in the chat. I managed to publish in the format that I derived from Audit Resolver and added some modifications to make it not just for storing, but also for exchange of the reports, assertions, decisions, whatever we want to call them. And the RFC document in there also lists all of the use cases that I intended to cover, and the list is quite long.
Awesome. Yeah, I did add, I saw you added that, ZB, and I added to the references and resources here, put it beside your audit resolver PR that I know has been open, RFC has been open for a long time, number 18. So hopefully that's captured there now as well. Appreciate the reference there. So want to quickly maybe let Tierney go over the initial RFC and sort of the outline and sort of reason why you made this. We didn't have a lot of time last week, so maybe you can just give a quick synopsis of what it is you're looking to try to introduce and sort of the approach you took with the spec, like how you spec'd it out.
Yep.
So.
Largely, so the basics are, this is effectively a counterclaim mechanism intended to allow maintainers, and that part I think is a part I want to focus on and have a discussion here about is maintainers their group, but largely to allow maintainers to assert that their modules aren't impacted by advisories. Advisories is the NPM name of what audit uses. It's the NPM advisory site. Intentionally built it so it's not necessarily attached to that, but I do want to use that nomenclature here. Basically, this is a CLI, extension of the CLI that maintainers can use to say, hey, this advisory that went out for, let's say, Lodash, because that's what everyone likes to pick on. Sorry, JDD. This Lodash vulnerability is not applicable to us. It is presently a Boolean, so it is impactful, true or false. That is a point that people, had issue with, which I think is fair. But yeah, basically say this module isn't or is impacted by this ID, this advisory identifier, and with a comment, which was a very handy piece of feedback from the GitHub security team, which I appreciate, basically saying why the maintainer does or doesn't think that that vulnerability is applicable. That's basically it from the mechanism side. Ideally, this would also get surfaced through audit. So audit would, by default, ignore modules with impactful false assertions. And by ignore, I mean not surface when you type in pm install and you get a list of here is the low, medium, high, and critical. I think I could be off in that name, but basically drop it from that list unless you run audit with the unfiltered value passed to the assertions flag. Yeah, so basically also extending audit a bit to consume this and kind of smartly surface this information, and reduce the noise that end users who are either new. A good example of this would be, so the one that I spoke with Dan about was Create React App, and how when someone starts using Create React App, there's a bunch of vulnerabilities, and that someone just starting to use Create React App probably isn't going to be super familiar with JavaScript and isn't already going to be desensitized to audit. And so they get scared by that, which is a very valid thing. And, the Create React App team has assessed those vulnerabilities and has figured out that they're not actually impacting them. So effectively, they are unvulnerable. And this is a way to kind of help surface that knowledge from the maintainers to users without having to kind of communicate that one-to-one. It's a way to do it at scale. Yeah, so that's kind of that side of it. Of course, being very upfront that there is a way to always get all of the information available. And yeah, that's basically the proposal here. I see Wes and ZB have their hands up. I think Wes was first.
Yeah. Wes, did you want to go?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to add on to the sort of problem statement that Tierney laid out, which I think is spot on. If anybody wants to check out the video that Darcy and I put together for the OpenJS conf, we did a series of interviews with people, including some people on this. Oh, hi, Adeline. And one of them was the maintainer of Node.js, which has similar user base like Create React App, and Nick is the maintainer we interviewed, had a very similar bit of feedback about their new users and the fear. And then they had a very specific case where they wanted to make a counterclaim. And in this case, and I don't know if we want to go into too many details, but basically there was some caveats around the counterclaim. It was like, okay, well, we'd like to get this updated, but we can't. And this is why. And users, unless you were in this very specific case, which no one really was, because that's just their user base, and it was pretty straightforward to not introduce the security vulnerability, it just didn't apply, right? And so there's a lot of precedents, I think, outside of just those two examples that might also to be honest, that was one of the things I think maybe in this RFC, looking at the discussion and some of the directions it took, I feel like, unfortunately, some of the folks who are a little less familiar with the discussions that have happened in this group, the package maintenance group, and a few of the others, maybe are getting frustrated with our responses, but it's not because we're not responding well, or I don't want to say correctly, because obviously there's certain opinions involved here, but I think that there's a lot of missing context for those folks. And I think the RFC as it stands might benefit from laying out a bit more of the prior art and foundation that this discussion has, not just Dan's post. And I think, just to bring those folks up to speed a little bit better, because I feel really bad the way that the one person has seemed to feel, and I don't know their name offhand, because I understand where they're coming from. It's just we've hashed out a lot of these conversations in prior pieces, and so it feels like we need to maybe at least have some go here first, read all of these things, watch some of these prior discussions, the video, maybe like some of this other stuff that's absolutely applicable here, even if it doesn't end up all directly being a part of this RFC. People just take this RFC and sort of run with the entire supply chain security story. And the fact that we don't have like a call out at the beginning that says, hey, this is not meant to tackle all these other things. We recognize that we're going to make compromises, like might be valuable to add. Anyway, sorry for my rant.
It's good. That's good feedback, Wes. Like in terms of like scoping this conversation is the key. I know in other deep dives as well, that's one of the things that we want to narrow in on, and might be good just so that we stay on topic here, as well as like defining the scope of just what this RFC is specifically, what the topic is, and conversation we want to have. But it's also good to like document that. So that might be a good takeaway, Tierney, for us to add. CB, did you want to comment?
Yeah, so I wanted to get into a bit of a nitty gritty maybe for some, but I think it's important to add this on. So this is going to be mostly referring to my comment in the pull request with the RFC that starts with bold deep dive statements. So it's a wall of text, so maybe not all of you are familiar. But to summarize it shortly, the idea is the current way this RFC defines a counterclaim is not sufficient for claiming against your own dependency. So if you're a package maintainer, your package is called Lodash, since we're talking about it already, and you want to claim that one of your dependencies that's marked as vulnerable is not used in your package in a way that makes you vulnerable. It's not enough to give the advisory ID. The module would be, depending on the interpretation, I think the RFC is not 100% just one option here, but I'm assuming the module value would be the name of the package in your dependencies, but then this is not complete information allowing you to ignore this or counterclaim this because it doesn't pinpoint the specific package. And this is something that I aimed to solve in my previous work with Audit Resolver. And what I'm doing there, and I'm going to recommend it to everyone, is to point to a path in your dependencies. Otherwise, you're opening yourself to a situation where you evaluate that a certain vulnerability is not affecting you in your direct dependency. And then another of your dependencies takes the same vulnerable dependency, takes it on, it appears as a new dependency in your tree with another version update. And you're already set up to ignore that vulnerability, even though there's a new supply chain leading, and I mean dependency path, leading to this vulnerability that might actually be active this time. So what I'm suggesting is, well, I'm going to be direct about it. I'm suggesting adopting the format that I documented for pointing at a dependency and storing the decision about it. The format includes the advisory ID and path in dependencies. It also lets you declare that you intend to represent a specific package whose recommendations these are. So this format can be used to exchange the information as well. And I know I'm pushing for my work, but this is one of the possible implementations that I intend to open for discussion and improvement within the group out there in OpenJS Foundation. But my main point is we need path. We cannot just specify the module.
So I would like to actually raise something that got brought up to me in a different venue. I would actually prefer that this or any mechanism of this be based on something that is being built by other experts that is portable. It seems like, through the discussion of this, Vex, the Oasis CSAF stuff, I don't know what the correct name is, but I'll call it Vex because that's what it seems to be referred to in their heading. Let me post the link here. It's linked in the RFC meeting minutes and the issue. But I posted it in the chat as well. This format seems to be a not standardized, but openly developed format that I if this is something we're going to go down, like if we're going to go down the route of like defining a spec for this, I would prefer that we base it on the work of others who are trying to do this in a more wide scale thing and who are frankly more experts on this than we are. Like I am not an expert in this to the degree that these people are by any means. But whether it's, Oasis or OpenSSF, there's work being done here, and I would prefer that we begin to build on the work of the security ecosystem rather than our own kind of special formats. Yeah. Bespoke. That's a very good word. Bespoke. Thank you.
I took out my thesaurus for that one. Wes, you still have your hand up. Would you like to comment, I guess?
Yeah, that was a re-raise just to chat about a couple of the things. So yes, I agree, Tierney, we should definitely be leveraging the community, other community resources. I did pass along some of the links that came up in this to some of the security folks at Netflix, and they were not aware of this work. So I want to be careful that we don't just pick a prior art for the sake of the fact that somebody else did it. We should be really pretty careful about vetting. So I read some of the links posted, and this is what I was trying to get at from the person who posted it. I think that there's first, one of the documents just seems like incomplete. And then I'm on my phone, so I can't click the link you posted to be sure if that's the same one I remember looking at. The other one didn't raise any, like the folks that I talked to. Now, this is not a representative sample, so I'd love to hear from more folks in the community. But my contacts at Netflix had not heard of that effort. There's also the Google one. Is that the same? Or is that a different?
No, I think that's different than what we're talking about here.
Okay, because I think they cover some of these things as well. So I would really love to have like maybe a good comparison of what different features these support. Because I didn't see a mention of some of the stuff in the links that were posted in this thread of the same kind of things that ZB is mentioning. So like maybe it's just a matter of us working with those groups to get these features or whatever key pieces of data, like the transitive dependency path, whatever it is, into one of those would be great. But I also want to say, I don't think there's anything wrong with us treading new ground as long as we vet that we're not like reinventing the wheel for no reason. I do think, and this is one of the things Darcy and I talked about in the presentation video, was like JavaScript has this problem 10 times more than anybody else. And if these groups, and if I looked like the Google one was like looking at Go and a few other as sort of their first class targets, I think probably because it was written by one of the founders of, or authors of Go, but like they just have a very different set of problems than we have. And I was looking at their work and it's like, well, okay, yeah, it could work, but we need to extend it in a bunch of ways in the, like they leave room for the extension, but it doesn't necessarily like codify it. And so like either way, we're going to have to come up with some language specific things to help us express what we need to express. So I just want to make sure we balance that conversation. Like, I think we should be reaching out to those folks, maybe inviting them to have a conversation with us and say like, hey, can you share how this works so we can figure out how it would apply to NPM, how it would apply to, JavaScript projects. Unless they have better white papers, because the white papers that were linked are like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Not very descriptive. So
just so I capture what you're saying correctly, you agree with us pulling in the subject matter experts and also poking on the organizations that have already tread some of these paths already. What might be good is, it sounds like you're referencing, Wes, like, let's at those people potentially, or bring them into this conversation. Is that right? Is that a good summary?
Yeah,
like the next
yeah,
action item there would be, hey, let's like get their eyes on like this RFC, maybe even explicitly.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we should also have a specific ask of them to help us understand how their proposals would fit into our ecosystem. Because that's, I think, what we're really looking for, because none of them, that I like literally searched a couple of those documents for NPM and JavaScript, and they like barely reference it, which is fine. That doesn't make it wrong. It doesn't mean it won't work. We just need to have, not just assume based on reading some of their docs. We need to, I think, have some good interaction with them. Maybe some folks from GitHub security also would be able to chime in. Like I said, I talked to some Netflix folks, and I'm sure some of them would be happy to join in it as well. But I think GitHub has a much more unique position here. So hopefully
Mike's waving his hand. He's from our security team and leading product there, so that he's started to join these conversations for sure. CB, I see your hands up, and then Miles, I know you're also waiting to comment. Feel free to go, ZB.
I'll try to make it quick. So in defense of the bespoke format, it's been used in a while for over 4 years now. And this is the next iteration of it. So it does have some experience behind it. And I think the biggest benefit of a bespoke format is that it's going to be human readable and small in scope. These referenced ones, when I read through them briefly, they seem very heavy in terms of what you can do with them and the size of the spec. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like at least one of them is focused on each vulnerability having a separate, like I would imagine a separate file or a separate advisory, or how we want to call them, which overall they seem like an overkill for our situation, where it would be very hard and would require a lot of knowledge, context, or tooling to be able to create a correct specification of that. Meanwhile, what we really need is something very specific to how dependencies work and is not found in those or many other examples of prior art, where we can have copies of the same dependency. That's pretty unique for the NPM ecosystem, as far as I know. And to have that and not much else, we basically have to have a format that's bespoke for at least a carefully selected subset of an existing format.
Miles?
Hello. I'll get on camera again so you can see me. Hello. A little bit of a tangent, but just something worth bringing up. And I think this is kind of partially what Tierney was getting at to here. I think that there's going to be a lot of motivation to fix things in NPM, which is reasonable because there's a lot of things that we can improve. I do think that there also, though, will be a lot of motivation to come up with solutions that, in my opinion, can be a little bit over-engineered, extremely large in scope, and much harder to like execute and roll out, as opposed to kind of smaller, as we refer to them at GitHub, like paper cuts, that we could roll out faster, quicker, and actually solve the problem. To me, the problem that we're talking about here, there's a bunch of them. But one of them is that there's a lot of noise, which is the inverse of there's not a lot of signal. And I think it's important to remember both of those, because almost every solution I ever hear is about reducing noise, but never actually about increasing signal, which is a whole other thing we can go down. There are ways that I think we can solve this with UX. just in what the CLI prints out to people. What we have right now is super freaky in the way that Dependabot rolls things out. I think that there's things that we could do that are like smaller iterations that clean it up a bit that could reduce a whole bunch of the noise, which goes into the other thing that seems to be a major problem that we hear from a subset of folks that are some of our most active customers, is the amount of additional labor that this is creating for, already overtaxed open source volunteers, which is a problem. I'm not going to say that it isn't. I, though, am not 100% convinced that necessarily, solutions that go in the space of overrides or heavily engineered new infrastructure is going to be the solution. I personally think that this boils all the way down to CVEs being somewhat inherently broken, and I use that term kind of loosely. You have this concept in the CVE of severity, and that severity, high severity is availability. So if you have a DOS, it's extremely high severity. That is completely non-contextual. If you're using a CLI tool, I don't necessarily, it sucks if it crashes, but that's not high severity to me in that context. One idea that we've been tossing around a bit in a few different cases was the idea of applicability as another axis to manage things. The other thing too is we always kind of think of things here very binary, on or off. It's vulnerable or if it's not vulnerable. And that also, when we think about some of the solutions we're seeing here, kind of leans into that it's hey, it was turned on as vulnerable, so I want to turn it off so it's not vulnerable anymore. Versus if we had a trinary of very bad, and non-existent. This starts to get into that space where we're solving for increasing signal as well as reducing noise, where we could say, hey, this one's really bad. You should definitely pay attention to it. And so kind of summing up all of that, I am extremely concerned about proprietary solutions that carve out an island for NPM to paper over a problem that arguably is not an NPM problem. The NPM problems specifically that we have right now are usability, UX, and noise. Not maybe even take out the noise, but the problems that we have around knowing how applicable a CVE, a vulnerability is to the context of how you use it, is this super wide ecosystem problem that we're not going to solve by creating, in my opinion, better ways to ignore it. And so I do think that we will have a quicker to market solution with a more guaranteed outcome of improvements by coming up with smaller scoped UX improvements that we can make to both the NPM CLI and potentially to Dependabot that we can roll out over the next quarter or two, while we, at the same time, engage with people in these standards, engage with the people who are running these vulnerability databases, and think about how we solve this problem of applicability, which I don't think is an NPM specific problem. This is an ecosystem-wide security issue. That's it for me for now. I think Wes has their hand up.
Also, Mike had his hand up first, I think. Yeah.
I've been taking a lot of notes and have a lot of thoughts, but I'll try and keep it quick. I'll go in kind of reverse order. A couple of things that Miles said struck me. So the comment about signal to noise, we did this in Dependabot. We had sort of towards the middle and end of last year, just a lot of customer satisfaction issues because we were sending way too many alerts. We went ahead and changed it to no longer notifying affected folks for low and medium and only doing high and critical. I was just looking at the data on this. The fix rate, or the, well, I guess two things. The sort of engagement rate on the notifications has remained roughly the same, and the patch rate has trended slightly up over time, but the customer satisfaction aspect has gone up significantly. So this was Miles's point of the noise was reduced and we were able to make people happier, but I don't think that we actually made the ecosystem more secure. And so I think there is more to be done, but I do think that the customer satisfaction and happiness is sort of a leading indicator to change occurring in the future. So that was, I think, a very reasonable point. I think there was the second one on reducing the work for maintainers. And I was thinking about this a lot because it felt like one of the sort of main points of tension in the proposal was, what if a maintainer is malicious and marks something as safe when it's not? The sort of like, there's a human element of choice that goes on here. And I was sort of thinking, like, is there a way of removing the human from the element? I know that some tools have the ability to just do static analysis and check if a function is called. And so there's part of me that's like, oh, can we, at least me, because I work at GitHub, we can look at code on GitHub and say, yes, you actually call this function. And I'm curious if that's a signal, and like, that's a very different signal than saying mark safe. It's like, we know you're affected. Or there's a high probability that you're affected. I'm curious if thinking about it from that lens would shift the conversation a little of like, it's static analysis, you can't argue with static analysis versus this is a human judgment call. I see people laughing about canning argue with, yeah, computers are hard. The other thing that we were thinking about was starting to only alert on direct dependencies. So that, again, this is a noise problem of like people who are downstream, they probably can't do anything other than choose to not use whatever the upstream dependency is. I think if we stopped alerting on directs and potentially if we stopped, notifying indirects in either GitHub or downstream tools, that would probably do a lot for customer satisfaction. And then the last one on the standards. So my colleague William, who commented on the doc, is more of the standards wonk. I admit that I am much more of a pragmatist. The two standards mentioned, Vex and Oasis, and then the Google one, they're not really complete. There's still a lot of discussion going on. I know William is attending Black Hat and they're talking about it there. So they're still very much in flux. Though I've had a couple conversations with him, the implementation mentioned of sort of, package or module version status, status in terms of impacted, and then a comment is minimal. And so I'm not super worried as long as we have those. That is the sort of subset that I think ZB mentioned, like we're going to be fine. We've had to do this in other things at GitHub as well. So the advisory database is effectively the same thing. We had to come up with a minimal subset of things that are required. We've had to do some translation between, the Rust format and Google's doing their own one with Go. It's a little tedious, but it's not the end of the world to do those. And so I am less worried about us backing ourselves into a corner. I think that the standards are all generally reasonably well aligned on like, that's what we want to get done. I will say the other thing, a lot of the standards care a lot about SBOMs and provenance. So the whole goal there is less about, they care a lot less about advisories and resolving advisories to never getting to an advisory in the first place. And so they're caring a lot about how are they doing package signing and how are, if someone signs this from an IP range that's outside of the normal one, or it's from a different maintainer, like flagging those things as potential signals early on. So if the standards seem a little white papery and wonky, it's because they're aiming for that longer goal rather than this like very tactical, yeah, we just need to mark something as impacted.
Right. I'm not sure who was first, Wes or Tuni. Did you want to follow up on them? Wes was? Okay. Wes,
yeah, mine. I have a gambit of responses because there was a lot. Yeah, we've talked about a lot. So I think both of these last two topics are not within scope, I think, here. And so here's why I think scope is so important for us to have this discussion. Talking about SBOM, and how we, Miles said something like the source is that the CVEs are, we got to fix this at the source. These are not NPM problems. These are not JavaScript problems. These are industry-wide problems. And that's why I don't think going deep into them until we have established one that will, unless we are vetting them to see whether they will work for us. I don't think going deep on this call And I don't think going deep in this forum is the correct answer, because we need to have some decision makers, right? And you are all the NPM decision makers. Maybe we have some GitHub representation, which is awesome. But if we're going to repurpose this meeting to be how is Dependabot going to work with the ecosystem tooling? How are we going to, I need this to work for me at Netflix, and probably that means having some SNCC folks in because we pay them for something I'm not actually sure what. But those are the kind of things where this spans, if we're going to talk about those parts of the issue, which I absolutely think we need to, I just don't think that we're going to be able to fit that into this RFC or any single RFC for sure. And I think it's a really broad topic that's going to need, hours and hours of conversation for us to vet these different, and maybe that's something you all at GitHub can do because it's your domain and you are allotted time to do that in your product roadmaps. I would love it if you could report back on those things. I will personally be trying to keep up and read along with them and learn as I go, and then again bring in Netflix security folks to help inform my opinion and help as well. But I really think that this is not we need to focus in on either a couple of these RFCs, like Miles said, maybe some UX changes first. And not try to boil the ocean here, which is what all of these topics have been going to. Which I'm not saying the ocean needs to boil at some point. It just is not necessarily us who needs to do it right now to make meaningful and impactful change in the tooling we have. So I'm worried that we're going a bit astray from Tierney's proposal. And maybe that's not super valuable, or maybe we need to move the conversation over to the collab space so that we have a non-NPM specific forum to bring people in. I don't know. I just don't want us to go too far down this rabbit hole and then all of us leave this meeting and say, well, we just spent 45 minutes talking about problems we can't solve, right? Which is what it feels like a little bit right now, to me at least.
Right. Tierney?
So I do mildly agree with Wes. I would absolutely fucking love to see Dependabot get better, because I have plenty of feedback that's felt like it's gone into a void. I also don't think that this is the forum to discuss that feedback. I am happy to provide that feedback. I don't think that this is a useful place to discuss it, or at least not in the context of this specific topic. Maybe the RFC meeting is, but perhaps this deep dive isn't. And I could be wrong on that. Miles, you might have different thoughts on that then. Okay, I'm gonna DM you, Mike. You might have a differing opinion on that, Miles. Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess kind of digging in a little bit more there. I think the reason why I was bringing all of these various things up, Wes, was not about expanding scope. It was more about actually cutting scope. It's about I don't personally feel that overrides or turning these off or ignoring these errors, I feel like those are band-aids to the problems that we're dealing with that are caused by CVEs, and that I think we should try to focus on a tighter scope that's around usability before we do, as you refer to it, like boiling the ocean. That I think that there are smaller, iterative, in-scope, CLI-specific improvements that could be made. And potentially, the only reason I mentioned Dependabot in conjunction is because the noise coming from Dependabot, the GitHub advisory database and the NPM advisory databases are intertwined. And so if we lower noise on one, we kind of need to do it on both, or it's not a full story. I am, for a number of reasons, not convinced right now that allowing third parties to turn off notifications on their, I'll rephrase it. I maintain a package, that package has a vulnerability. I don't think I should actually be able to stop people from being warned about that. And I know that there is a debate about that where people are saying, I'm the person who knows the code the most. The whole value to me of audit is the fact that it's a third party. If I can just turn off all of the audit notifications of every single thing that's vulnerable in my package, then we may as well just turn off audit. The value of it is that it comes from a third party. That is independent from the fact that the way that it's reported is noisy, that the way that it's reported is scary, that the amount of extra work that it's creating for maintainers is not valuable, that there's too much noise and not enough signal, that there's no way to hear about the ones that are the most applicable. Those are all, to me, completely separate issues. And I think that a solution that is like, I just turn this off for all of the consumers by itself, it creates more problems than it solves.
So,
I just want
so can I
one sec,
chime in?
Wes.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
One sec. Let me quickly comment on what Miles just said, and then I'll, since I haven't commented quite yet on that. So already a good portion of the ecosystem does turn off npm audit by default because they use a different package manager. So Yarn and PNPM do not do auditing by default when you're installing packages. So it's like, it's just good to recognize that, you know, the tooling ecosystem at large, is fragmented, and that the recommendations that we have for npm are not shared. You know, like our values are not shared, and the product is not the way that we see the value in audits is not shared with everybody else in the ecosystem. So just want to be mindful that when we're talking about the value of CVEs and bubbling up vulnerable packages, like our strategy is different than some of our competitors, let's say, or our peers. So and then yes, Wes, feel free to top up, and I'm not sure Tierney or ZB who was.
I'll be rather quick but it was directly to what Miles said. So I just wanted to say, so I think we are talking about some specifics of this RFC about maintainers doing this assertion. One thing that we dropped from this conversation, but we had with a few other folks, is the ability to have a trusted third-party source. So in this case, at Netflix, we don't want to trust NPM, like not, we want to have our own layer of trust, right? And to do that, what I want out of this is actually the interchange format, and then to be able to point NPM at some of our packages or some server that we have that provides this interchange format of things that our security team vetted, right? Or some internal maintainers or whoever, and that's not involving NPM Inc. or, well, I guess GitHub, whatever now, however you all decide this feature belongs. But right, so I that's something I would want out of this. And if we went with defining an interchange format and a way that NPM could consume that interchange format, I think that would be a lot more beneficial, and it would remove one of the key things, Miles, you said, which is like that level of trust. You want a third party. So now we could then go and Netflix could publish ours internally, and then we decide, oh, well, maybe there's some use open sourcing this, and somebody could say, okay, I trust their judgment. Or, specific security companies could do the same. And then that would give us a larger ecosystem, I think, to adopt this, at the same time really strengthening that security aspect that you talk about, which is not necessarily putting more work on the maintainers. It's letting non-maintainers provide value by vetting security, and then you just have to find one that you trust that's not necessarily the distributed maintainer ecosystem. Anyway, sorry, I'm done.
Sure. So I'd like to reclaim, just because I ceded some time to Miles because he specifically wanted to address a single point. First, I do want to counter what Miles said, and that is the way that Miles framed this RFC is not what it does. It does not specifically allow people to just maintainers to explicitly ignore or silence dependencies for all of their users. Like there is a hatch that people can use, like if a Netflix or a Google or a whatever cares, to still get all of that information. And I think that is an important point, that it's still that information is never not available or never completely hidden from you. It is just we are taking information from provided by maintainers to supplement what the third party, which is presently npm, is sending, right? So it's adding on to that third party data with additional context that is from that subject matter expert, which I think is different than saying basically I just turned this off and there's no way to ever hear from it again. there was other points I had, but I've at this point lost them. So go ahead, ZP.
Okay, so what I wanted to achieve, and I linked to a blog post, which was a reaction to Dan's Twitter thread in the first place. So what I wanted to achieve is to make something like, if you remember early on with AdBlock, there were a bunch of people who were creating lists, and to this day, one of the lists is named after a guy who started it. I envisioned this counterclaim mechanism as anyone being able to publish curated lists of which dependencies of which packages, or which dependencies in general, when this dependency path exists in your tree, are safe to ignore or are already fixable, etc. So the format actually covers three distinct ways to market for now. Anyway, the idea is that NPM would be one of those publishers, and you can opt in, or with NPM client, if you want, you can make it opt out of the curated list coming from NPM. But you can have a list from React ecosystem that would cover React, Create React App, Redux, etc., where you trust them to know what they're talking about. So it's not every maintainer that can counterclaim. It's the maintainers or the organizations you trust that can counterclaim. And that solves, that does away with the whole problem of anyone being able to counterclaim and hide something because they got mad and they decided to write a script that counterclaims everything that shows up in any of their 200 packages, which I bet someone will do once we release this. So what I'm getting at is we can make it distributed, and we can make it distributed without taking away the ability for NPM to curate their own list.
Does anybody have any comments on that?
I mean,
This is what I was talking about. Big thumbs up.
I do. This specifically defeats the purpose and the reason that, you know,
no, it can be opt out.
No, but
NPM
can I finish though? This defeats the purpose and the frustration that was expressed, which is, I am someone new to JavaScript and React. I don't know what's happening. I npx what would it be, npm exec React app, right? And then I'm all of a sudden alerted by a million vulnerabilities. I'm not gonna start adding trusted people by default. Like, I'm not gonna have that already. And that, like, you either have to start prompting people to opt into that, or which then gets to the point of, I keep getting asked to opt in to trust this person. I'm just going to either trust everyone or trust no one, which makes the feature useless. Or I have to start telling people as a middleware maintainer, like as a transitive dependency maintainer, to trust me, which also like gets weird and defeats the purpose for those who don't. And so like that removes the utility of such a function.
So I just want to quickly interject, as we only have about 6 minutes left here. I just want to quickly say, Tierney, I do agree. At least we've had conversations in the past, and we've actually had some discussion about where this information lives. And at least my support is for any kind of extra metadata, any counterclaim mechanism, any kind of like source of truth should be coming from the exact same place that the advisory came from. So like, I don't believe that you should have to configure 2 separate sources of truth. And I know that there has been recommendations or ideas brought up in the past about potential, distribution of ignore lists or things like that, or even, which I don't think are necessarily, personally don't think that those are necessarily good ideas. If you're going to choose a trusted source for your advisory information, then that should be the same source that any kind of counterclaim or metadata would also be coming from. But also, I just want to give Wes one more chance here to chime in, but one, be mindful that we only have 5 minutes left. And I would like to get maybe some action items or sort of next steps in terms of this conversation going. So Wes, I'll let you have some time here, and then ideally we can sort of wrap things up.
I'm happy to table my specific points if we can get actual action items. And so I'll say what I think the action items need to be, and then everybody else can add theirs. But I think we need to decide what problem we're solving before we start digging too deeply into these solutions, because even the conversation and the issue, and then there's a lot of little details that I think are very important once we get to the point of actually rolling a feature. I think this jumped the gun. I think that we might end up doing something like this. I actually think we should. Like, I'm all thumbs up for this. I just think that, like, to Miles's point, and everybody's really in agreement that there's just a lot of parts to the security story that we don't really have a good answer for. And some of them may end up being more important than counterclaims. So I just want to make sure that we don't try to make counterclaims the end all be all feature and we spend a ton of time on it, and then find that really this other thing that was much easier to do could have been 10 times more impactful. So I really think we should take a action item to start and get the darn meeting scheduled in the collab space and talk from a slightly higher level, not just about NPM. Get a few of the security folks involved from GitHub specifically. But again, I think we should, tap our resources to bring as many in as we can to see if there's, maybe one extra field that the advisory databases could accept from reporters, and it would suddenly solve a whole ton of the counterclaim problems. Those discussions haven't even really been had in this group, with these people yet. So I think first and foremost, we need to have the problem statement really ironed out. And I think the collab space is the right place to do that. I think secondly, for this specific RFC, I think that there's both gaps in the features required, some of the ones that ZB pointed out with dependence, transitive paths. And, I think some of the things about whether it's applicable being just a Boolean or whether it needs more context, some of those things I think are pretty big gaps and would block this from being finished anyway. So I would propose that the RFC either be fleshed out to add a bunch of those things that have been mentioned in the comments already, and to really iron those out and maybe make a much larger section of unanswered questions, something like that, so that we have real concrete things to work off and we don't spiral like the conversation sort of did so far in the issue. So I think those are the two, to me, that would be the most impactful action items from this. Okay.
So based on the couple minutes that we have left, CB is also +1 in your feedback there, Wes. So I've added at least an initial action item, which I thought was brought up along our conversation here, Tierney. If you're okay with providing some more scope to the RFC itself, just to contextualize and try to focus the conversation and feedback you're going to get on the RFC, it should help with people not trying to boil the ocean as we've discussed here. There's a second item or action item that I've queued up here based on Miles's feedback and internal discussion that we've already had. Our team is definitely willing to and would like to look at how we could improve the existing output of audit and whether or not there's some design decisions that could be made to just make that experience better in general. And I feel like that's sort of a paper cut type issue and may not even require necessarily a whole RFC to improve that experience. And this kind of goes back to what Mike also was saying in terms of the changes made to Dependabot, that quality of life could be improved for developers, whether or not we're actually fixing the root cause with some of the changes we make there. It might just be that again, people are more likely to potentially action on some of these advisories if it's presented to them in a nicer way. So it might just be this is a way that we can look at solving this through UX and design, just to make things better. So I'm putting that as an action item as well. And then in terms of any other action items, like there's obviously the, which I'm not going to take as an action item for us, but Wes, I know you continue to reference the collab space. That's something that I think we can take offline and discuss how we want to engage maybe some of the referenced external foundations that are also doing work in this space, and how we can collaborate with them in specifically that group, right? So I'd rather be more tactful here with the conversation we have for this Open RFC call, specifics to NPM, and then within terms of like trying to solve the larger problem at hand without the collab space. Let's keep an action item over there to reach out to those other organizations, I think. So does that make sense? Does that sort of capture? Did anybody else feel like there's something else that we should add here? No? Well, I appreciate everybody jumping on. I know we're about a minute over. We'll be back next week, hopefully with a more regular agenda. And this doesn't mean we won't go deep into this again when we have some progress and sort of updates to be had. I know, Tierney, there's going to continue to be discussion on this RFC, and hopefully folks feel like they can continue to add feedback, and we'll try to continue to flesh this out. So appreciate everybody jumping on, and hopefully see you next week. Cheers.